Even if our nuclear weapons came for free, I would oppose them. And that is because of the danger they cause. As long as we have them, as long as we have them deployed, as long as we have policies to use them, they are a threat not just to our country, they're a threat to the entire civilization.
That's the voice of former Secretary of Defense William J. Perry discussing his new book, The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump, co-authored with Ploughshares Fund Policy Director Tom Collina. Perry is today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Collina.
Welcome back to Press the Button, and thanks for joining us for our 65th episode. If you caught up with last week's episode, you know that we are doing things a little bit differently now. With Joe's retirement from Ploughshares Fund, he has stepped down from his role as co-host of the show. So gamely stepping into that co-host role is our very own Tom Collina. As you might know, Tom is the Director of Policy here at Ploughshares Fund and the author of a newly published book that we'll be diving into during the main interview today. He has decades of experience in the nuclear security field, and it is my pleasure to introduce him for the very first time as our new co-host. Welcome aboard, Tom.
Thanks, Michelle. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm really happy to join the Press the Button team. So let's get going.
So first, we need to talk about the nuclear news. Tom, what do you have lined up for us on Early Warning?
I just sat down with a great interview with Erica Fein from Win Without War and Anthony Wier from Friends Committee on National Legislation. We were discussing the hopes that many progressives had and still have about how can we change the focus of Pentagon spending, given the realities of the pandemic and how we have to spend money on other higher priorities, including climate change, public health, and addressing racial injustice.
And afterwards, our listeners will be hearing from Tom again, except on the other side of the interview table. I sat down with him and former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to talk about their new book that just came out last week, The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. We talk about how, for decades, the U.S. nuclear arsenal has been geared around the wrong threat, and why the next president must take steps to reshape our forces and the way we think about nuclear risks before it's too late. We also hear from Secretary Perry about why, after all these years, he is still working to raise the alarm about the dangers posed from these weapons. It was a fascinating and very timely discussion that you do not want to miss. And after you listen, I know you'll want to go read the book and listen to the new Perry Project podcast, At the Brink.
If you believe nuclear issues like the ones we're discussing are not getting enough coverage, then you can help us elevate the issue by sharing Press the Button with your family and friends.
And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Del, and welcome to our listeners to Early Warning. We are going to talk today about the federal budget, and specifically the Pentagon budget. There were great hopes, certainly among many progressives, that after the coronavirus and the surprise of how devastating that was to the nation and the world, that there'd be an opportunity to rethink national security, of how we spend our $740 billion defense budget, and whether we should be spending more on underappreciated dangers like pandemics, climate change, and now issues and new challenges like racial injustice. And I think we're seeing now how difficult that's going to be. And as the federal budget starts getting reviewed in Congress for the next fiscal year. And to help us understand that process, we have two fantastic speakers. Erica Fein, who is Advocacy Director at Win Without War, and Anthony Wier, who is Legislative Secretary for Nuclear Disarmament and Pentagon Spending, at Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start, Erica, with you. Of course, there is an effort in the Senate and also in the House, led by Senator Sanders and others, to cut 10% out of the Pentagon budget. So a sizable amount of some $70 billion. To go along the lines we were just discussing, to reorient Pentagon spending to other higher priority needs. Erica, tell us more about this effort and where you see it going.
Great. Yes. So the first thing that folks should know is that there will actually be a vote on this amendment, which is somewhat surprising and something that we have to work hard to get support for over the next couple of weeks. So the vote is supposed to take place in the Senate the week of July 20th. And it's possible, though not confirmed, that there will be a similar vote in the House around the same time. And really, in an era where defense spending has increased astronomically, it's going to be difficult to get this done and to pass this into law. But the world has also changed a lot, as you alluded to, and the entire country, is really awake to the fact that we are spending way too much on weapons and wars. This is an attempt to try and correct the misbalance in national spending priorities that we've seen in this Trump administration, but also for a very long time before that.
Now, this effort by Sanders, he's bringing together, I assume, a whole host of NGOs that don't normally work together. Is this that kind of a expansive network supporting this very focused legislation?
Yeah, there was an effort to get supporters for the amendment, and there are over 60 organizations supporting it right now. Win Without War will have a public whip list on our website focused on who has said publicly that they will be supporting, so that we can generate, real momentum and enthusiasm for grassroots activists and people who, are just coming to this fight, but know how important it is to really relay to our elected officials that they want to see a change in the status quo.
Great, thanks. And Anthony, turning to you, we had a vote last week in the House that in a sense was kind of a microcosm of this, where Congressman Ro Khanna tried to take $1 billion out of the land-based ballistic missile nuclear program and shift that to coronavirus pandemic spending. Give us your sense of what happened there.
Sure, Tom. Well, in a year where so much has changed and so much is being questioned, the Democratic-controlled House Armed Services Committee kind of put forth a proposal that it was essentially not questioning in any particular way the Trump administration's proposed nuclear weapons budget request. And Representative Ro Khanna of California challenged at least one element of this proposal, which is to triple the funding for the proposed new replacement for America's intercontinental ballistic missiles. This is something called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program, which is ramping up construction now and poised to be ready sometime by the end of this decade. And Representative Khanna said, look, instead of tripling this budget this year and all that's changed to $1.5 billion, let's keep it level at last year's level, which is still a hefty sum of $500 million, and kind of revisit where we need to go with this. Is it really necessary to replace it? Could we upgrade the current systems? Could we extend it? Could we question some of these things? His amendment was defeated 12-44, so 12 Democrats voted in support of, alongside Representative Khanna. 19 Democrats opposed the amendment, along with all of the Republicans on the committee. And so really the signal is even the House Democrats are not really prepared to question the Trump administration's proposals for nuclear weapons this year and are poised instead look to the election and see if perhaps a new administration could open up opportunities for revisiting some of these proposals.
Thanks. Both of these things seem so common sense, right? A 10% cut from what we already know is an excessive Pentagon budget, and shifting $1 billion from a nuclear weapons program that we don't need and makes us less safe into coronavirus. And yet, at least on the ICBM portion, we couldn't even get Democratic support for this. What is going on here? Why is this so difficult? And do you see this gaining steam over time?
Sure. Just quickly to say, members of Congress tend to say the same things that they said when they first got elected, because they just don't believe there's any evidence to change that approach until voters present them. And so what we've seen with the national uprising, the action in the streets to demand changes in our criminal justice approach and our larger approach to racial justice, Congress has to take notice of that. And so really the bottom line is if people want their members of Congress to change, they have to communicate that and make it clear to them that there will be actual ballot box consequences for failing to make those changes. And so that's really what matters is getting people's voices heard and forcing the change in the conversation. Congress isn't going to lead the change. It's going to have to be the people who lead that change. And Congress will slowly, painfully, failingly catch up.
Thank you very much. On that note, our time is up. Erica and Anthony, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Today, I am thrilled to have on the show former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry and Ploughshares Fund Policy Director Tom Collina, who are here to discuss their new book, The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump. Tom, Secretary Perry, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
And for our listeners, Secretary Perry was the 19th Secretary of Defense for the U.S., serving from 1994 to 97 under President Bill Clinton. Among his many roles and accolades, he is currently the Michael and Barbara Berberian Professor at Stanford University, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, and founder of the William J. Perry Project. Tom Collina is the Director of Policy here at Ploughshares Fund. He was formerly the Research Director at the Arms Control Association, the Executive Director and co-founder of the Institute for Science and International Security, and the Director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, first of all, I am thrilled to have you both on, and I am so excited to discuss your new book, which I think could not have come out at a better moment. In the book, you lay out how the greatest risk of nuclear war comes from accident or miscalculation. And you say that for decades, the U.S. has prepared for a surprise Russian nuclear attack that never arrived, and in all likelihood, never will. And throughout the Cold War, you posit, and even today, Russia and the U.S. are focused on the wrong threat. And so what I wanted to know from you is, why? Why are they still focused on this wrong threat? And how did this realization about the risk of accident and miscalculation change your thinking about what our nuclear weapons and policies should look like?
I have asked myself that question many times. Why are we still responding to the wrong threat? And my best answer to that is because most people in our country don't think about the nuclear issue at all, don't think about nuclear threats. Once the Cold War had finished, they put this thought from their mind. So it's just something they don't think about. It's true of ordinary people, it's true of people in Congress. It's true of many people in the executive branch. Those who do think about it tend to think about it in terms of the Cold War. That is, instead of really thinking it through, they have just reverted back to the Cold War thinking.
Well, I agree with everything Bill just said, but I might just add, as Bill said, a lot of these policies got set during the Cold War. And then the Cold War ended, and we never really rethought these policies. And I think a major reason for that is that inertia builds in, right? A policy gets set. You get a lot of people invested in that policy, in the government, in careers, in contracts, billions of dollars of contracts for these systems. And so an inertia sets in, and it becomes very difficult to change the policies, even if the underlying rationale for the policy in the first place is no longer true. And so what it takes is presidential leadership from the top, particularly with nuclear policy, which is, we may discuss, really is up to the president. The president determines nuclear policy. These are the president's weapons, as we explain in the book. And so it's very hard to change nuclear policy without leadership from the president, from the top. But as Bill said, it's hard to get that presidential leadership without the public pressure. And since the end of the Cold War, it's been hard to get that public pressure. So you need the presidential attention, but you don't have the public attention. And that makes it really hard for the president to maintain the political will that's necessary to see these things through. And we saw as recently as President Obama, who really came in with great intentions of how to change nuclear policy, but found that it's politically very difficult, and he eventually got distracted and moved on to other things.
Secretary Perry, if, as Tom is talking about, that we have this default thinking and this inertia, how do we overcome that?
That's a very difficult question to answer, but it's one which Tom and I have asked ourselves over and over. We do that by trying to educate people, educating members of Congress. Tom has been working on that for years, and educating the public. We do that through op-eds, through papers, through books. I wrote the book several years ago, My Journey to Nuclear Winter, was precisely that purpose. And of course, our book, The Button, is for that purpose. So you do that by trying to educate people. And it's not enough, it's necessary to educate political leaders, but that's not sufficient because the political leaders do need some public support. So you fundamentally have to educate the public as well.
Tom, one of the things that I know you and I have talked about quite a bit, especially in the lead up to this election, and what both of you write about in the book, is what steps the next president can take to lower the risk of nuclear war. You outline 10 steps. What do you think are the most important, most immediate things that need to happen?
In the final chapter of the book, we have the 10 top recommendations for a safer world. But in interest of time, I'll boil those down to 3. And it goes to this central notion that we write about in the book, that we're focused on the wrong threat, and that we're focused on a intentional bolt from the blue surprise attack from Russia, which is simply much less likely than the fact that we could blunder into nuclear war by mistake. And the 3 key policies that keep us sort of trapped in this risk of blundering into nuclear war are sole authority, first use, and depending on ICBMs, our land-based ballistic missiles. And certainly the sole authority issue is something that most Americans simply don't realize, that the president, and in this case, President Trump, really does have unilateral authority to launch U.S. forces anytime, at any moment, within minutes, which is just tremendously dangerous given false alarm dangers that are driven primarily from our land-based ballistic missiles that are vulnerable and that are and certainly susceptible to being launched under a false alarm. Thereby starting nuclear war by mistake, which I think is probably everybody's nightmare. So the top 3 things that we would change is, one is end sole authority for presidents. They should share that authority with Congress. We should not have a first use policy. The United States should have a policy of only using nuclear weapons to deter their use by others, and that means to retaliate, never to use them first. And third, to phase out our land-based ballistic missiles, which we see as not necessary for deterrence and really an accident waiting to happen.
One of the things I really appreciated about the book, I've heard some of the stories that you detail about the false alarms, although the level of detail in them were things I didn't know. For example, the November 1979 false alarm, where the training tapes made it onto the regular warning display. I'd always heard the story that, somebody accidentally put it in. I didn't realize that there actually wasn't a satisfactory answer to how that software made it there. As you were doing research for the book, and based on your own experiences as you started compiling them, did you have any other moments like that where you just realized the extent of the problem or the gravity of it?
I think the story that is most comparable to the story that we tell in the book is the story of the false alarm in Hawaii. This is in recent enough history that people can relate to it better. And that story is told very compellingly by several of the people who actually lived through it. Here is a case in modern history, just a few years ago, where citizens of Hawaii got a very credible false alarm, and they really thought an ICBM was coming to land on their state. And they were seeking cover, and they were saying their prayers. They thought it was all over.
Michelle, if I could just add, in the process of writing this book, I learned a couple of things that were tremendously important and I didn't realize before. And one of those was in writing the chapter on cyber threats to our nuclear forces. I simply did not realize how vulnerable U.S. nuclear forces, and particularly the command and control system, was to cyber attack. And once you realize that an adversary could potentially hack into the system and make it show a nuclear attack that isn't really there, and given the short decision times that we give our president to make a decision, and the vulnerability of the systems, particularly the ICBMs, it's very, very worrying. And certainly my concern increased during the process of writing the book, that we could really find ourselves blundering into nuclear war. And in fact, this is the scenario we write about at the beginning of the book, blundering into nuclear war as a result of a cyber attack that creates a false alarm that the president simply doesn't have the time to understand before he or she has to respond. And so, to me, it was very eye-opening, and it made the conclusions of the book all the more time urgent.
I want to pick up on that thread. You've both listed some really immediate and recent events and concerns. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, this book seems to have come out at a particularly chaotic and turbulent time for the country. And I wanted to know why you chose to write this book now. Of all the things that you could be doing, speaking out on, focusing on, why this book and why now?
Well, in my case, the simplest answer is because I'm 92 years old. I've been trying for a decade or two to get this message across to the public. And so I thought I needed to have one more stab at it while I'm still alive and have the energy to do so. And the difference between this book and the other books that I've been involved with is that it's written for the general public. It's written so it can be accessible to anybody. You don't have to be a technical specialist. You don't have to be a nuclear specialist to understand the points being made in this book.
Michelle, I think for me, and I'm tremendously grateful that Secretary Perry agreed to take part in this project. But for me, it was trying to take advantage of the 75th anniversaries that we have this year of the first nuclear test on July 16th, and of course, the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, plus the fact that we have an historic presidential election coming up in November. And so trying to take advantage of all those things to focus on issues that are very difficult to draw public attention to at any other time, and to see if we could find a way to draw all of the disparate concerns about nuclear weapons policy onto one issue, to really focus public attention. And to me, that one issue is presidential sole authority. To me, it's kind of the tip of the iceberg that we can get people to focus on. And if they focus on that issue and see it for what it is, they'll discover underneath the water all these other issues that are there.
Drawing out that a little bit further, Tom, how would you see the U.S. changing the policies around sole authority? Is that through executive order? Is that through congressional engagement?
Great question. I think it depends on the policy, and it depends on who the president would be. I mean, I think certainly we're not expecting any changes from President Trump or a second Trump administration. If Vice President Biden is elected as the next president, I would hope that a President Biden would declare a no first use policy as a presidential directive. He came very close to that in the Obama administration. I think he would not have to come very far in his thinking to get to no first use, although it would be huge. It would be a huge shift in U.S. policy for the better. And that would take care of, obviously, the first use issue. It would also take care of sole authority for first use, because our main concern about sole authority is in a first use situation. We're not so concerned about sole authority in retaliation, because in that case, you're in nuclear war, and letting the president or his delegate make that decision in that dire, awful situation may make some sense. The other thing we're hoping for from a Biden administration would be to rethink the ICBMs, the land-based ballistic missiles, and Vice President Biden has no position on this, has not spoken on it, so we really don't know where he would go on this, except to say that in a Biden administration, faced with the economic pressures that we can foresee now, right, the huge deficit, the need to repair the economy, the need to respond to the coronavirus, the need to deal with global warming, the need to respond to the demands of racial inequalities that have built up for generations. All of these things will take money. And there's a lot of money that's being spent unwisely on nuclear weapons. So we're hoping that the next president will take a hard look at the $2 trillion program to rebuild the nuclear arsenal and say some of this money can be better spent elsewhere. And the top candidate for us on that is the $100 billion program for the new ICBM.
Secretary Perry, is there anything you would add to that?
I have always been concerned with the vast amounts of resources we're putting on nuclear weapons. So the money issue is an important issue, but to me, the more important issue is the danger. Even if our nuclear weapons came for free, I would oppose them. And that is because of the danger they cause. As long as we have them, as long as we have them deployed, as long as we have policies to use them, they are a threat not just to our country, they're a threat to the entire civilization.
Secretary Perry, we've talked how you have spent so much of your time following your service in government to warn about nuclear dangers. Through your book, through the Wall Street Journal editorials, your work through the William J. Perry Project videos, and I love the podcast. I've heard the first episode that you're co-hosting with your granddaughter, Lisa Perry. What is driving you to keep speaking out? And for you, at what point would you rest easier knowing that the next generation has taken up the charge? What does that look like?
For decades, I have tried to get this message across to the public so that we would change our policies that would greatly reduce the risk we now face from our nuclear weapons. So I keep trying new ways of getting the message across. This book is one such way, and it's noteworthy largely because of Tom's skill in writing. This book is written in a language which is accessible to the public, accessible to most people. Most of the books I've written in the past are written too much in a technical terminology, too much in terms for the specialists. But because of Tom's gift in writing for the public, this book, I think, can now be accessible to the public. So that's an important change. But beyond that, I want to, of all of the people who do not understand this problem, the young people stand out foremost. And that's ironic because they are the ones who are most likely to be seriously affected by it. So I see a specific challenge to get the message across to young people. I thought a podcast might be a better vehicle for doing that in the book. And I thought, if we're trying to get the message across to young people, why don't we have young people as part of the project? And so I asked my granddaughter, Lisa Perry, to take the lead and help me prepare these podcasts. They are accessible to anyone. They're in a language which anybody can understand, young, old, medium age. The reason that I do that, what drives me to keep speaking out on this, to not give up, as frustrating and as disappointing as I've been with the response in the past, I keep trying. I keep trying because the problem is so serious. The existential danger is real. It is a real danger to our existence. So I keep speaking out, not for myself. I have lived 92 years and I've lived a good life. But I have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so I guess the main reason I keep speaking out is my 8 grandchildren and my 4 great-grandchildren.
Well, Tom, Secretary Perry, I just so appreciate you taking some time to talk with me today about your new book. I highly encourage all of our listeners to go out to buy it and read it. It's excellent. And Secretary Perry, you succeeded. It is very accessible and very much a story that anyone can understand. Before we go, any final thoughts that you hope our listeners take away, whether from this interview or from the book itself?
Well, I really want to thank Bill for his stick-to-itiveness, that he's still involved in this at 92 after so many years, when he could be sitting on a lake somewhere fishing for trout. He's doing this, and that really inspires me to keep going and to keep trying harder to explain these issues more effectively. And I really want to hand it to Bill for giving me the vision that motivated the book by looking at U.S. nuclear policy as focused on the wrong threat. And I think for all too many people, nuclear weapons policy is esoteric. It's a bunch of jargon. It's 15 different issues that somehow got chopped up, and no one quite knows how to keep track of it all. And one of our goals in this book was to try to bring it all together, in a sense, under one unified theory or way of explaining it, to help people grapple with what is ultimately a very simple issue, is that U.S. nuclear policies are making us less safe, and it's really up to the next president to change where we're going.
Well, with that, Secretary Perry, Tom, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Michelle, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.